Is everyone recording?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. My name is Nathaniel, also known as Diipak. That's my artist and spiritual name. Where I'm from in Connecticut, we have a town called Scotland, Connecticut, and there's this amazing, festival every year in the fall. That's they put on like a full-on Highland festival with like the sports and the bagpipes and the fiddles and the kilts and the clan colors and everything. And it's we used to go every year to that. And there was a girl in my class growing up in primary school that was a very good Highland dancer, and she did like the sword dance. She brought in her swords and like did her sword dance for us, and it was really cool. So that made a big impression on me. So I think these things these seeds that get planted sometimes grow a lot later. One thing led to another, and then I realized there was like all these parallels between Robert Burns and Bob Dylan, who was like one of my favorites, and that pretty much sealed the deal for me. So when I heard that Red Red Rose by Robert Burns is Bob Dylan's biggest inspiration, supposedly. Oh, my love's like the red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love's like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. As fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I. And I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas gang dry. Till all the seas gang dry, my dear, and the rocks melt in the sun. And I will love thee still, my dear, as the sands of life shall run. And I called you all, and you were all very kind and willing to do this. So here we are.
You don't say no to Diipak.
Hi, I'm Ashley. So I live in Scotland. I live in a little town called Denny, which is 20 minutes from Glasgow. And I suppose getting into Burns has just been a part of my life, I suppose, from as young as I can remember, whether it be learning these poems at primary school, having Burns suppers throughout later primary school, throughout high school. And I was a bit of a swot at school, I suppose, so I quite enjoyed literacy and learning these poems and having a passion for Scots language. And even today as a teacher, I'm really keen to make sure that the children know, the background and know these Scottish poems and words that most of them do. A lot of them still use daily. So yeah, I suppose even my family still celebrates Burns Night. We have haggis, neeps and tatties. We sometimes come together, the men in their kilts, and we all wear a bit of tartan. So I just found out today actually that my granddad and my uncle, their middle name's Burns, but we don't know where that came from down the family line. So that would be quite good to explore.
I'm Christopher, and I'm from Burns land, so to speak. So I grew up on a little town called Largs in Ayrshire. And of course, Burns was from Ayrshire, a little bit further down the coast from me. And like Ashley, I also sort of grew up on a steady diet of Burns at school. In many ways, it was kind of force-fed to us as school children as well. I'll hold up my hands and say I wasn't that much of a swot. I mean, sure, we memorized a few pieces of poetry, but then I guess I lost touch with Burns the older I got and went through university, and then since then I've kind of lived abroad. I've been away from Scotland, and I tend to find that the longer I'm away from Scotland, the more Scottish I become, and I'm always looking on ways to reconnect with my Scottishness. And it just so happened that a whole bunch of things kind of came together at the same time. I was doing some family tree research, again, making that connection with Scotland, and came across like a distant relative who had written a number of Burns-inspired poems and songs from my town that had been published in the local paper like 200 years ago. And I also have, like when I started these discussions with family members, I also find that older relatives have also had a passion for Burns. So like I've had a grandfather who was very passionate about Burns and would regularly speak at Burns suppers. And so I decided that it was time for me to learn a little bit more about the guy who came from my home shire, and I registered for a course at Glasgow University, a distance course with Burns, and found myself really fascinated with it. And then another strange coincidence was that while I was doing that, Nathaniel, that's when you got in touch with me asking some questions about Burns. There's something that happens to you not only when you're away from Scotland that you want to connect with Burns, but when you hit a certain age, that's what you were saying. And I think that when we started meeting and I've heard you performing, I thought, well, this is something I'd like to continue. So this is a good opportunity to kind of get me back into my studies and review some of the things that I grew up with. So thanks for inviting us.
It's the 40-year-old Burns crisis.
My name is Patrick. I was born in England, and we spent most of my primary school years in the Highlands in Argyll, in Appin. My mum was born in Glasgow. I always grew up hearing a lot of the music, a lot of Scots music in general. Call the Yowes to the Nows, call them where the heather grows, call them where the barley rose, my bonny dear. Hark the mavis evening song, echoes Cloudon's woods among, then a folding let us scan, my bonny dear. Now the Cloudon's cloudy towers, wearing misty moonlight hours, oh, a dewy bending flowers, fairies dance say cheery. Ghost no bogle shalt thou fear, thou'rt to heaven and love so dear, naught of ill can come thee near, my bonny dear. Call the Yowes to the Nows, call them where the heather grows, call them where the barney rose, my bonny dearie. Lovely as thou art, thou hast stolen my very heart. I could die and still not part from thee, my dear. Call the Yowes to the Nows, call them where the heather grows, call them where the burnie rose, my bonny dearie.
Burns Night, of course, celebrates Robert Burns' birthday, and that's Monday the 25th. And he's regarded as Scotland's national poet, although he himself referred to himself as a bard rather than a poet. And there's kind of a class difference there. So he would more identify with this Celtic tradition of being a storyteller rather than being a poet, which is somewhat elevated above him. And sometimes he's referred to as the ploughman poet. because his father and himself, they were both farmers. So he grew up in a farming community. But this title of being the farmer poet, or the ploughman poet rather, is also a little bit of self-promotion, because back in Burns' day, when it came to trying to get your material sold, you needed a public. And the public were really thirsty for this idea of the sort of the heaven-taught genius, this kind of uneducated raw talent, because they believed that the refined culture of its time, as great as it is, had kind of lost touch with something a little bit raw. And so he sort of played up to this idea that he was uneducated and that he's just a simple ploughman. But he was much more than just a ploughman. He was uneducated. He didn't have a formal education, just like anyone of his standing at that time. But his father did hire a private tutor for him. So he knew a lot about poetry. He knew a lot about songs, and he worked hard. He was much more than just this ploughman poet or this sort of God-given genius. And this is also something that in poetry, they refer to it as the modesty topos, which kind of disarms the reader of his poems. So he's, on one hand, he's saying, oh, I'm not a poet, I'm just a bard, and I don't know really what I'm talking about, I don't need to be elevated. But the way that he actually puts that particular argument towards the reader suggests that he's a lot more than that. And you can see a lot of the influences from sort of classic literature, like classic Greek and Roman literature, as well as some of his contemporaries as well, like Pope, for example. You can find examples in his poetry too. But as a ploughman poet from Ayrshire, I remember this particular poem that I'm going to recite, which is To a Mouse. And To a Mouse would be written when he was 26 years old. Him and his brother were in Ayrshire. They had the same farm together. And according to records, I like to think this is true. His brother says that he composed this while he was actually holding a plough out in the field, that you could see his lips moving as he was composing poetry, and then he would come in and write this poem. And I think that what we see in this particular poem as well is Burns is more than just a bard or a poet. He's also a humanist and an environmentalist as well. This is To a Mouse on turning her up in her nest with the plough from November 1785. We sleeket coorin timorous beastie, oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. Thou needna start awa so hasty with bicker and brattle. I wad be laith to rin and chase thee with murder and pattle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union, and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. I doubt na whiles but thou may thieve. What then, poor beastie, thou maun live? A diamond icker in a thrave, so small request. I get a blessing with a lave and never miss it. Thy wee bit housey too in ruin, it silly was the winds are strewn, and naething now to big a new in, o foggage green. And bleak December's winds ensuing, baith snell and keen. Thou saw the fields laid bare and waste, and weary winter coming fast, and cosy here beneath the blast thou thought to dwell, till crash the cruel coulter passed, out throw thy cell. That wee bit heap o' leaves and stibble has cost thee mony a weary nibble. Now thou's turned out for all thy trouble, but house or hald, to thole the winter's sleepy dribble and cranrach cald. But mousie, thou art no thy lane, improving foresight may be vain, the best laid plans of mice and men gang after gley, and Leah's naught but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, thou art blessed compared to me, the present only toucheth thee, but oh, I backward cast my ee on prospects drear, and forward, though I canna see, I guess and fear.
I went into a great website where they have like this scanned music. This is like a really old, PDF. You can see the notes are like the stems of the notes. Some of them look backwards to us because nowadays, if they're going up, you have them on the right side, and if they're going down, you have them on the left side. But here they.
It was in sweet Senegal that my foes did me enthrall, for the lands of Virginia, torn from that lovely shore, I must never see it more, and alas, I am weary, torn from that lovely shore, I must never see it more, and alas, I am weary, all on that charming coast is no bitter snow or frost like the lands of Virginia, their streams forever flow, and their flowers forever blow, and alas, I am weary, oh. Their streams forever flow, and their flowers forever blow, and alas, I am weary, oh. Now this burden I must bear, while the cruel scourge I fear, in the lands of Virginia, and I think I'm friends most dear, with a bitter, bitter tear, and alas, I am weary, oh, and I think I'm friends most dear, with a bitter, bitter tear, and alas, I am weary, oh, and alas, I am weary, oh, and alas, I am weary, oh.
Go for it.
I'll have a wee drink of my own brew.
Do it.
So, Tam O'Shanter was written by the Scottish poet Robert Burns in 1790 while he was living in Dumfries. So, just to give a little bit of a background about the poem, it describes the habits of Tam, who was a farmer, and he was fond of a wee drink at a local public house in Ayr, and much to the annoyance of his wife, who was at home. So upon leaving the public house one night, a storm was brewing in the sky, and he came across the local haunted church, where he spotted witches dancing, the devil playing the bagpipes, and this obviously caught Tam's attention, and he rode up on his horse Meg to get a closer look, and one particular witch caught his eye of what she was wearing, very short clothing, and he shouted out, the place went darkness, music stopped, and they all lunged after Tam. He was going towards the River Doon, as creatures wouldn't cross the stream, but they did manage to pull at Meg's tail, taking the tail off. So it's an interesting poem, and it is it's one of my favourites, and as I say, one that's very popular at school, that the children learn. So we'll give it a go. When Chapman billies leave the street, and drouthy neighbours meet, as market days are wearing late, and folk begin to tack the gate, while we sit boozing at the nappy, getting foon Uncle Happy. We think, nah, the lang Scots miles, the mosses, waters, slaps and stiles that lie between us and our hame, where sits our sulking sullen dame, gathering our brews like gathering storm, nursing our wrath to keep it warm. There's truth fand honest Tam O'Shanter, as he frae airy night did canter, all dare when ne'er a town surpasses, for honest men and bonny lassies. O Tam has though but been so wise, as ta'en thy ain wife Kate's advice. She told thee weel thou was a skellum, a blethering, blustering, drunken blellum, that frae November till October, i market day thou wasna sober. That ickle meddler wi' the miller, thou sat as lang as thou had siller. That every naig was caught a shoon, the smith and they get roaring fuon. That at the Lord's house, even on Sunday, thou drank wi' kirked and jean till Monday. She prophesied that later soon, thou would be found deep drowned and dun, or catched wi' warlocks in the murk by Alloway's old haunted kirk. A gentle dames it gars me great to think how mony counsels sweet, how mony lengthened sage advices the husband frae the wife despises. But to our tale o' market night, Tam had got planted unco right, fast by inkle bleezing finely, wi' reaming swats that drank divinely. And at his elbow, Johnny, Suitor Johnny, his ancient trusty druthy crony. Tam loved him like a vera brother, they had been fou for weeks together. The night drave on with sangs and clatter, and aye the ale was grown better. The landlady and Tam grew gracious, with favours sweet and precious. The suitor told his queerest stories, the landlord's laugh was ready chorus. The storm without might rear and rustle, Tam didna mind the storm a whistle. Care mad to see a man sae happy, in drown himsel amang the nappy. As bees flee hame with loads of treasure, the minutes swing their way with pleasure. Kings may be blessed, but Tam was glorious, o'er the hills of life's victorious. But pleasures are like poppies spread, ye sees the flower its bloom is shed, or like the snow falls in the river, a moment white then melts forever. Or like the borealis race, that flitter you can point their place, or like the rainbow's lovely form, a vanishing amidst the storm. Nae man can tether time nor tide, the hour approaches, Tam on ride. That hour o' night's black arch the quay stane, that dreary hour he mounts his beast in, and sic a night the taxi rode in, as ne'er poor sinner was abroad in. The wind blew as twad blown its last, the rattling showers rose on the blast, the speedy gleams the darkness swallowed, loud deep and lang the thunder bellowed. That night a child might understand, the deil had business on his hand. Weel mounted by his grey mare Meg, a better never lifted leg, Tam skelped on through dub and mire, despising wind and rain and fire. Whilst holding fast his good blue bonnet, whilst crooning o'er some old Scots sonnet, whilst glowering round with prudent cares, lest bogles catch him unawares. Kirkalloway was drawn nigh, where geese and hoolits nightly cry. By this time he was cross the ford, where in the snow the chapmen smored, and past the birks and Meeklestane, where drunken Charlie's back's neck brain, and through the winds and by the cairn, where hunters fand the murdered bairn. And near the thorn aboon the well, where Mungo's mither hanged hersel. Before him doon pours a' his floods, the Dublin storm roars through the woods. The lightnings flash from pole to pole, near and more near the thunder's roll, when gleamering through the groaning trees, Kirkalloway seemed in a breeze. Through Irka bore the beams were glancing, and round was sound and mirth and dancing. Inspiring bold John Barleycorn, what dangers thou can make us scorn. We tippenny, we fear nae evil, we Uxcabay will face the devil. The swat sae reamed in Tammy's noddle, fair play, he curtnae deals a bodle. But Maggie stood right sair astonished, till by the heed in hand admonished. She ventured forward on the light, and vow Tam saw an unco sight. Warlocks and witches in a dance, nae Cotley and Brent knew fae France, but hornpipes, jigs, strathspeys and reels put life and metal in their heels. A winnock bunker in the east, there sat old Nick in shape of beast. A towsy tyke, black grim and large, to gie them music was his charge. He screwed the pipes and carved them skirl, till roof and rafters a did dirl. Coffins stood round like open presses, that showed the dead in their last dresses, and by some devilish cantrip sight, each in its cold hand held a light, by which her old Tam was able to note upon the haly table a murderer's banes and giblet airns, twa spung lang wee on christened bairns. A thief new cutted frae the rape, wi' his last gasp, his gab did gape. 5 tomahawks wi' blood red rusted, 5 scimitars wi' murder crusted, a garter which a babe had strangled, a knife a father's throat had mangled, them his ain son of life bereft, the grey hairs yet stack on the heft, wi' mair horrible and awful, wi' even to name would be unlawful. 3 lawyers' tongues turned inside out, wi' lies seemed like a beggar's clout. 3 priests' hats rotten black as muck, lay stinking vile in every nook. As Tammy glowered amazed and curious, the mirth and fun grew fast and furious, the piper loud and louder blew, the dancers quick and quicker flew. They reeled, they set, they crossed, they cleek it, till ilka carlin swat and reek it, and cooster duddies to the wark, and link it in her sark. Now Tam Tam had been their queens, a plump and strapping in their teens, their sarks instead of creasy flannel, being snow white 1700 linen, their breeks a my only pair, that ains were plush o' good blue hair. I would ha' gi'en them off my hardies, for I blink o' the bonny birdies. But wither beldams auld and droll, rig woody hags fid spina foal, loudpin and flinnock on a crummock, a wonder didna turn thy stomach. But Tam kent what would for Burley. There was a wench and Whirly, that night enlisted in the corps, lang after Kent on Carrick shore. For money a beast to dead she shot, and perish money a bonny boat, and shook baith meikle corn and bear, and kept the countryside in fear. Her cutty sark o' Paisley Hame, that while a lassie she had worn, and longitude though sorely scanty, it was her best and she was vaunty. Ah, little ken thy reverend granny, that sark she coughed for her wee nanny, wi' 2 Scots, 'twas o' her riches, wad ever graced a dance o' witches. But here my muse, my wing more cour, sic flights are far beyond her power, to sing how Nanny lap and flang, a supple jade she was and strang, and how Tam stood like an bewitched, and thought his very een enriched, even Satan glured and fig for fain, and hotched and blew wi' micht and main, till first he caper, syne another, Tam tint his reason altogether, and roars out, "Well done, cutty sark!" and in an instant all was dark. And scarcely had he Maggie riled, when out the hellish legions sallied, as bees busy wi' angry fyke, when plunder and herds assail their bike, as open pussy's mortal foes, when pop she starts before their nose, as eager runs the market crowd, when catch the thief resounds aloud. So Maggie runs, the witches follow, wi money in and riched skeal and hollow. A Tam, thou get thy faring, and held the roast you like a herring, and vain thy Kate awaits thy coming, Kate soon will be a woeful woman. Now do thy speedy utmost, Meg, and win the keystone o' the brig. There at them thou thy tail may toss, a running stream they darena cross. But ere the keystone she could make, the fiend a tail she had to shake. For Nanny far before the rest had upon noble Maggie pressed, and flew at Tam with fury settle, but little was she Maggie's mettle. Aye, spring brought off her master's hail, but left behind her ain grey tail. The carlin caught her by the rump, and left poor Maggie scarce a stump. Now a' this tale a truth shall read, egg man and mother's son, take heed, where to drink you are inclined, or cutty sarks run in your mind. Think you may bide roys, o dear, remember Tam O'Shanter's mare. Oh, that's a long one.
That is long.
Is there for honest poverty hangs his head for all that? The coward slave we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that. For all that and all that, our toils obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea stamp, a man's a goal for all that. What though on homely fare we dine, with hard and grey and all that? Give fools their silk and knaves their wine, we dare be poor for all that. For all that and all that, their tinsel show and all that. The honest man, though ne'er say poor, is king of men for all that. You see on Barky caught a load was struts and stairs and all that. Though thousands worship at his blood, is but a coup for all that. For all that and all that, his ribbon star and all that. The man of independent mind, he looks and laughs at all that. A king can make a belted knight, a duke, an earl, and all that. Honest bands aboon his might, he'd e'er be poor for all that. For all that and all that, their dignities and all that. Oh, pride of sin, pride of worth, oh, the day for all that. Pray that come it may, and come it will for all that. The sense and worth o'er all the earth shall bear the grief for all that. For all that and all that, it's coming yet and all that. When man to man the whole world o'er shall brothers be for all that. For all that.
Well, Green Grow, the Rashes, is again, it's another favourite. It's difficult to pick your favourites, but it's also known as one of the first of Burns' songs to appear in print. And we spoke earlier on about how he was a collector of songs and an amender of them. And there's this compilation of songs known as the Scots Musical Museum in 1787, and that's where we see Green Grow, the Rashes. But like I mentioned earlier on, this is something that Burns worked on. So this was something that took shape over a period of time. there would have been earlier versions of this song going back to even the 1500s, songs with similar titles, and he would also have been familiar with the music, the tune that goes along with this, I understand. But essentially, Green Grow the Rashes for Robert Burns, Rabbi Burns, is a reflection on, it's his treatise basically on life, particularly life of a young man. The way he saw it was that there were two classes of men, and in his correspondence with his publisher, he talks about what these classes are. He talks about the grave and the merry, and he defines the merry as impulsive pleasure seekers, men who go through life cheerful, but often live in poverty. Sounds like your typical artist, doesn't it? In Burns' own words, he talks about the merry as he who steals through the veil of life, amusing himself with every little flower that fortune throws in his way. And then there's the grave, the flip side of that coin. This is a more sober class of men, those who want to make a fortune, or they want to be remembered. They want their name to go down in history. Now, when he was writing down his ideas, almost in a dissertation form, they've been called many things. One of them was called the labor of an inexperienced raw moralist. So this is a young man writing about what life, the meaning of life, essentially. And Burns writes of his musings in the fragment that becomes Green Grow the Rashes, that as it is a genuine language of my heart, it will enable anybody to determine which of the classes I belong to. So when you listen to the song, you can work out, is he the merry or is he the grave? But whatever he is, he's certainly speaking the true language of his heart. When you hear the song, again, it's interesting how he goes about dividing up the verses. Verses 2 and 4 are dedicated to the grave of these sober men. In verse 2, we hear about how elusive and ultimately unsatisfying it is to pursue riches. And Burns notes that the opposite to that is to spend your time in the company of the fairer sex, which means that all of life's worries are suddenly cast asunder. He derides as asses those who think of themselves as better for having chosen more intellectual pursuits. There's a good line in this song to listen out for where he says, "For you so douce, ye sneer at this, you're not but senseless asses, oh." And Burns is not espousing this hedonistic lifestyle or deriding education in any way. What he's actually saying with this song is that the grave, these sober men should be cautioned against jumping to conclusions or judging the merry. And towards the end, he even reminds us with this allusion to King Solomon that even the wisest of people have sought life's pleasures. So Burns admits later on in his own correspondence, before he's finished writing this song, that he needs more experience in order to contemplate these things in any depth. And after some time, it's quite interesting that he adds perhaps this song's most important verse, which is the final verse. So it's taken him some time to come to this conclusion that women are somewhat superior to men. In that final verse, the creator is cast in the feminine, practicing her art first on man before perfecting the art and then creating women. So this is Green Grow the Rashes, as it was written originally, and I guess we'll hear the song version of it in just a moment. Green grow the rashes, green grow the rashes, the sweetest hours that e'er I spend are spent among the lasses, There's naught but care on every hand, in every hour that passes, What signifies the life of man, and twerna for the lasses, The worldly race may riches chase, and riches may fly them, And though at last they catch them fast, their hearts can ne'er enjoy them, But gie me a canty uratine, my arms about my dearie, And worldly cares and worldly men may aga talps of teary, For ye seduce, ye sneer at this, You're naught but senseless asses, oh. The wisest man the world saw, he dearly loved the lasses, oh. All nature swears the lovely dears, her noblest work she classes, oh. Her prentice hand she tried on man, and then she made the lasses, oh.
There's no but care on every hand, and every rule that passes, oh. What signifies the life of man? It were not for the lasses, oh. Green grow the rashes, oh. Green grow the rashes, oh. Sweetest news that e'er I spent among the lasses, oh.
The worldly race may riches chase, and riches still may fly them all. And if at last they catch them fast, their hearts can ne'er enjoy them all. Green grow the rushes, oh. Green grow the rushes, oh. The sweetest hours that e'er I spent among the lassies, oh.
But give me a can to you, Rattling. My arms about my dearie, oh. And worldly cares and worldly men, your gay taps of teary, oh. Green grow the rashes, oh. Green grow the rashes, oh. Sweetest news that e'er I spent among the lasses, oh.
That sneer at this, you know, but senseless asses, oh. The wisest man who ever lived, he dearly loved the lassies, oh. Green grow the rushes, oh. Green grow the rushes, oh. Sweetest hours that e'er I spent among the lassies, oh.
Swears the lovely dears, her noblest work she classes, oh. Her practiced hand she tried on man, and then she made the lasses, oh. Green grow the rashes, oh. Green grow the rashes, oh. Sweetest news that e'er I spent among the lasses, oh. Green grow the rashes, oh. Green grow the rashes, oh. The sweetest hours that e'er I spent among the lasses, oh.
By yon castle wall at the close of the day, I heard a man sing, though his heed it was grey. And as he was singing, the tears they do came. There'll never be peace until Jamie comes home. The church is in ruins, the state is in jars. Delusions, oppressions, and murderous wars. Though we dare not, we say, what we can was to blame.
our sons for Jamie through sword. And now I greet round their green beds in the air. It brought the sweet head of my faithful old dame. There'll never be peace until Jamie comes home. Now life is a burden that's bowing me down, since I tint my bands and he tint his crown. But till my last moment, my words are the same. There'll never be peace until Jamie comes home. The church is in ruins, the state is in jars. Delusions, oppressions, and murderous wars. Though we dare not be same, but we can was to blame. There'll never be peace till democracy comes home.
And yes, I just amended a Burns song.
It's all part of the folk process.
I fond kiss and then we sever. I farewell, alas, forever. Deep in heart-wrung tears I'll pledge thee. War in sighs and groans I'll wage thee. Who shall say that fortune grieves him when a spark of hope she leaves him? Me no cheerful twinkle lights me, dark despair around benights me. I'll ne'er regret my partial fancy, nothing could resist my Nancy. Just to see her was to love her, love but her and loved forever. Had we never loved, say kindly, had we never loved, say blindly, never met and never parted, we had never been broken hearted. Fare thee well, thou first and fairest, fare thee well, thou best and dearest, thine be ilke joy and pleasure, peace, enjoyment, love and pleasure. A fond kiss and then we sever, a farewell and now forever. Deep in heart-wrung tears I'll join thee. Deep in heart-wrung I'll wage thee.
Silver Tassie, I mentioned earlier on that I started getting into Burns when I found through research in my family tree that obviously Burns had been a big thing back in the day, probably was for many families, I dare say. But one of my distant relatives, and indeed his son, went on to be inspired by Burns, and they would do their own versions of Burns. So they would rewrite some of his songs and make it more appropriate for the local population of my town, Largs. And here they are. You can get them online,
Wow.
songs and verses.
Oh, so
John
cool.
Morris Hill and John Hill.
It's still in print.
Well, you have to look quite hard for it. Put it that way. My brother sent it to me, and it was a complete surprise when it came in the post, because I knew of this person, but I didn't realize that they were a performer in my town and held in quite high regard at the time.
Cool.
And when you read through the pages, there is no music that comes along with it, but just in brackets, just below each of the texts, it tells you which music should go along with this particular piece. And so then I went on a hunt looking for the music so that I could sort of play that in my head as I was reading. And there's this one song that he wrote called "Let Others Sing of Distant Lands." And apparently this was something that was composed by him in 1868, I think, is when he was writing this. And it goes to the music of "Gae bring my good old harp ain's mare." And I was thinking, what's that? And when I looked for it, it came up with "Go bring to me my pint of wine," which is also sometimes known as Silver Tassie. And so when I heard that song, on a famous song platform. There are many platforms out there, but the one I listened to, this made perfect sense to me. So it was really interesting to hear that, and then I started reading about Silver Tassie and all the rest of that as well.
So this is Burns-inspired poetry.
Yeah, from a very local perspective in Largs. Let others sing of distant lands, with pure and brighter skies, where orange groves and clustered vines in rich luxuriance rise. But I will sing Ain Mare dear, where like a fairy queen, surrounded by its neighbouring hills, sweet modest Largs is seen. O Largs, thy name has lang been famed for pure and bracing air, for rural walks and lovely beach, few with thee can compare. But climb thy hills and gaze around, there like a fairy scene, lie Brisbane Glen and Kelburn Woods, with modest Largs between. There may be spots to some more dear, more stirring and more grand, but where's the place so clean, so fair, as if by nature planned? And climb thy hills and gaze around, 'tis like a fairy scene. There Arran Hills, the Isle of Bute, and Cumbries lie between. Lang may thy walks, thy lovely beach, and healthful bracing air, thy cleanly streets with flowing streams be prized beyond compare. As lang we'll climb thy sloping hills to view thy lovely scene, on Gogo Braes we'll gather sleighs till old age intervene.
A pint of wine and fill it in a silver tassie, that I may drink before I go a service to my bonny lassie. The bone rocks at the pier frae the ferry, the ship rides by the buried law, and I'm on leave, my bonny Mary. Sound, the banners fly, the glittering spears are raking ready, the shouts of war are heard afar, the battle closes deep and bloody.
Rattling, roaring Willie, well he'll come to the fair for to sell his fiddle and buy some other wear. Parting with his fiddle, a salt till plenty see. Rattling, roaring Willie, a welcome him to me. Oh Willie, come sell your fiddle, say fine. Oh Willie, come sell your fiddle, buy a pint of wine. If I should sell my fiddle, the world would say I was mad. Then he's a ranting day, my fiddle and I, hey hi. As I came by Clorchel, I canna like it ben. Rattling, roaring Willie was sitting at yon board end, among good company. Rattling, roaring Willie, you welcome him to me.
That's about all there is to it.
Old acquaintance be forgot, never brought to mind. Should old acquaintance be forgot? Dave.
Wait, which is sort of obviously related to the current one, to the one we all know, but not entirely the same.
Yeah.
Oh, all the money that e'er I spent it in good company, and all the harm that e'er I did, alas, it was to none but me. And all I've done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass. Good night and joy be with you all. Comrades that e'er I had were sorry to see me going away, and all the sweethearts that e'er I had, they begged me one more day to stay. But since it falls unto my lot that I must rise and you must not, so fill to me the parting glass. Good night and joy be with you all.
Yeah.